Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Learn Live TV, the series around Bicep. And today we're going to talk about how we can deploy resources to subscriptions, management groups, and tenants by using Bicep. First, we're going to introduce ourselves real quickly. My name is Barbara Forbes, and I am a Microsoft Azure MVP, and I work as the Azure Technical Lead for OGD, which is in the Netherlands. And I'm here with John. Hi, John.
Hey, Barbara. How are you going?
I'm good.
That's good. So I'm John Downs. I'm an engineer at Microsoft. I work in the Fast Track for Azure team, which is the customer-facing part of the Azure engineering organization. Excuse me. I'm joining you from New Zealand this morning. It's very bright and early this morning. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning right now. And we're also joined by one of my colleagues. And I will just bring up his photo. There we go. Brandon. So Brandon is in the chat today. He's moderating the chat for any questions that you might have about any of the topics that we're covering. So say hi to Brandon, and please feel free to drop any questions in the chat.
Yeah. Hi, Brandon. So we've got 3 completely different time zones here. So we're representing pretty much every time zone around, I think.
Pretty much.
And I think this is the first episode actually of the advanced modules for Microsoft Learn. So we're starting really with the advanced stuff. If you're completely new to Bicep, you might want to check out one of the earlier modules that is available. And for this one, we're going to talk about deploying resources not only to resource groups, but also to subscriptions, management groups, and tenants. If you click the link right here, a little too soon, the link you can see here, then you can follow along with the module that we're going through today, or you can use a QR code. Do recommend that you first follow along with what we're doing and then do it on your own in a later time, which is also always freely available.
And I should also add that a couple of the exercises that we're going to be doing today, some customers might find it a little bit challenging to do those in their own environments just because they need certain permissions that you might not have. So it can be useful just to kind of watch what we're doing, and you can get the idea of how this would work if you were able to do it as well.
Absolutely. Especially this one. If you don't have the permissions for your own environment, then we can show you how it would actually look.
Awesome.
So what goals are we trying to reach here? What should you be able to do or know when we are done with this session? We're going to talk about resource scopes. So what different kinds of scope can you use? A tenant, management group, and subscription. Not too much about resource groups because you're probably already familiar with that, as that's the default. We're going to actually deploy stuff to those different scopes, even multiple scopes in one Bicep template. And that's the final one. Even one Bicep template, and you can create multiple scopes so you can do as much as you want in one template.
Awesome. Now, one thing to note is this is quite a dense session. There's a lot of kind of concepts and material that we're going to cover. So feel absolutely free to go back and review the Learn module later and kind of walk through some of the exercises if you have permission to do that in your own environment, because some of these concepts are a little bit more challenging than some of the things you might have been working with already.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what we're talking about today. So most of the time when we deploy Azure resources, we deploy them into resource groups, as Barbara mentioned. But there are actually some types of resources that are deployed at other scopes. So these scopes are either the subscription, that's the Azure subscription that a resource group might live in, a management group, which sits above a subscription, or even across an entire tenant, and a tenant being like your entire Azure estate, essentially. So by using Bicep, you can actually create and configure all of these different resources at each of these different scopes. And we'll talk about a whole lot of examples as we go about scenarios where you might want to do this. And then, of course, all of the details about how you do it. But once you do implement this, sorry, Barbara.
Is it true, do I remember correctly that when ARM template started out, you weren't able to do it at this kind of level? You could only use resource groups?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So some of these concepts are a bit newer in Azure Resource Manager. Some of them have, I think we definitely started with resource groups. I think subscriptions came a bit later, and then management groups and tenant deployments came a bit after that. But of course, by using Bicep and by using all the techniques we're going to show you today, you'll be able to get all of the different benefits of infrastructure as code that you've already been used to. So things like being able to track your deployments and understand the history of a deployment, review your deployments with your team, all those kinds of things. You can do that across not just kind of what we call your workloads, which are the things that run SQL databases and storage accounts and so forth, but even across your entire environment. So your policies that you apply, role assignments, a whole bunch of other things that we'll talk about as well.
Yeah.
Oops. So as we always do, let's talk about a scenario that we're going to follow through for today. So if you've watched any of these sessions before, you'll know that we play the role of a hypothetical Azure administrator at a toy company. And today we're going to continue that scenario and think about a toy company that has a research and development team. And that research and development team is very, very secret. They're doing a whole lot of secret toy development work, which is very mysterious. And they've just started up a new project called Project Teddy Bear. Now, the team is very concerned about secrecy for this project. So what they've asked us to do is to firstly create a new dedicated Azure subscription to prevent any information about their project from being exposed to the rest of the company. So we're going to work with them to stand up that subscription and get it all ready. They also, as part of their work, they're going to be putting virtual machines into that subscription. But even though the R&D team apparently is very well funded, they don't have infinite money. And so they've asked us to also help to put in some limits around the types of virtual machines that can be deployed within their subscription. They've also said to us, we need to create some virtual networks in the future. So we'll help them do that as well. And we also want to make sure that we're doing all of this in an automated way, because we're going to be expanding the number of subscriptions in the future too. So we're not just going to be doing this one Project Teddy Bear. There's going to be a bunch of other secret projects in the future as well. So in this module, we're going to learn about all these different scopes that Azure resources can be deployed to, and also some of the common resources that you'll use when you're doing that. So you'll create a Bicep file to deploy to a subscription, to a resource group, to a management group. And in the process, we'll learn about some of these features of Bicep that you might not previously have encountered. So firstly, we'll talk about setting the scope of a Bicep file by using the target scope keyword. We'll also use modules, which you hopefully previously had some exposure to, and also the scope keyword to deploy your resources to specific scopes, even within multiple scopes within a single deployment. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the resource group, subscription, management group, and tenant functions, which give us access to specific information about the scopes that we're deploying to, and let us also target specific scopes as well. So by the end of this whole module, by the end of this next hour and a half or so, you'll be able to create Bicep files that you can deploy at the subscription, the management group, and the tenant scopes. And as Barbara mentioned before, you'll be able to create and use Bicep files to deploy across multiple scopes, even within a single deployment. So Barbara, can you tell me what a deployment scope actually is? We keep talking about this, but what does it mean?
Yeah, we've been talking about it a lot, but what are we actually talking about? So like we just said, you were probably already used, if you've been working with ARM templates for a while and then moved to Bicep, then you are used to deploying stuff to resource groups. And a lot of stuff is deployed to resource groups. Most Azure resources actually are, and I think it's pretty close to like 90% of the stuff that you deploy to Azure needs to be in a resource group. But there are a few resources that do not need to be in a resource group, or actually cannot be part of a resource group. So they need to be in a different scope, either subscription or management group or a tenant. And we see one of the examples in the next slide is a policy. Like we saw in the example, policies cannot be deployed to a resource group. They need to be deployed to a subscription, or finally, they can be part of a management group, but overall, they are a bigger part of your Azure subscription. And what you see is that the resources that are at a bigger level than a resource group are actually management resources. Like a policy is meant to enforce people to do certain things a certain way, or audit that they are doing certain things a certain way. So it's all about governance and security when people are using your Azure resources. And another thing that, for example, cannot be part of a resource group is a management group, which you can deploy through Bicep, but it cannot be at the resource group level. And to understand that management group thing and the subscriptions that we're talking about, it's important to understand that there's a hierarchy out there. So the picture shows it pretty well. At the complete top, there's the tenant. Tenant is always the part where Azure AD lives. And you don't actually do that much with it when you're working with Azure resources specifically, but it's always at the top. And in the tenant by default is the root management group. And below that, you can create your own management groups to sort of have an administrative separation between resources. So that's an important thing to realize, that this is purely for your administration. So this is purely for setting permissions or setting policies or just keeping track, especially in a large environment, of where everything is. So it's not really a boundary between resources. All these things can talk with each other. It's purely for managing and for keeping track of stuff. So you have the management group at the top. Then in a management group, you can put subscriptions. In the subscriptions, you can put resource groups. And in the resource groups, you can put the resources, which you can.
So Barbara, just to be clear, so you're saying, for example, if I have a virtual network or virtual machines in one Azure subscription or within a management group, and there's another Azure subscription within the same management group, do they automatically get access to each other? How does that work?
Well, they can reach each other's resources without issues. So you can put a virtual machine in one subscription and have it be connected to a virtual network in another subscription. And that's not a problem. But if you look at users that can have permissions, so if you have an owner or if you can have a contributor, then you can set it on the subscription level and they won't be able to access the other subscriptions. Or you can set it on the management group on top of that. So in this picture, if I add someone as a contributor to the production management group, it will have contributor rights to both marketing and products. So you can use it as a way to keep track of where you give permissions and only do it in one place.
Mm-hmm. Now, Barbara, I've heard about things called landing zones. How does that relate to what we're talking about now?
Yeah, that's one of the more known use cases you have for a management structure like this and for infrastructure as code when we're talking about that. With landing zones, what you do is you create an environment where people can have sort of their own little piece of Azure. So if you have a certain application that you need to run in Azure and a certain team needs to run it, then you make a subscription for them and they can use it on your own, and you can secure stuff by using policies. So you can use policies to make sure that for this example, they keep a certain SKU or they add everything to a certain region and stuff like that. So it can be very handy for enterprise customers, which have a lot of teams that need a lot of resources to work with. So you don't have to manage them all.
Cool. Awesome. So let's talk about what you might actually deploy into all of these different scopes that Barbara's mentioned. So firstly, when would you deploy to a subscription? Well, one thing that you might need to deploy to a subscription is a resource group, right? You've been working with resource groups throughout the journey of learning Bicep. Resource groups actually themselves are subscription scoped resources. So you can actually create resource groups from within a Bicep file as well. And in fact, we'll see how to do that a little bit later. Or if you need to do something like granting access to a user or some other principal to all of the resources within a subscription. So this is a very common thing particularly in enterprises, where they'll have particular people or particular teams who should have access to everything within a particular subscription so that they can manage it or get visibility of what's going on. And then also, if you're using Azure Policy, then you can apply policies for all of the resources within a subscription as well. And as we talked about before in our scenario, this is actually something we're going to look at doing. So, excuse me. So we can define or apply policies at a subscription scope, and then all of the resource groups and all of the resources within that subscription inherit that policy. Now, when we think about management groups, well, we can do some of those same kind of things, right? We can grant access to resources within a set of subscriptions. So if we've got a group of subscriptions that all sit within the same management group or within the same hierarchy, then we can grant access, through that management group. And so, for example, if there's a cloud operations team or some other team that manages your Azure environment, you might actually give them access at the root management group scope to be able to view your entire environment. But I will say, if you do that, you need to be extremely careful, right? Because this permissions are inherited throughout the entire hierarchy. And so if you do grant somebody access at the root management group scope, that is a very, very powerful set of permissions you're giving them. So you want to be very careful about how you do that. And you want to make sure that you audit them carefully and that you don't grant unnecessary privileges.
The least amount of privilege is so important for this one, especially with Azure environments. They get larger and larger. And people have far too much privilege to do stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as a general rule of thumb, you'd want the number of role assignments at a management group scope, or certainly at the root management group scope, to kind of be a number that you can count on your hands, right? You don't want to have 50. You want to have like less than 10, ideally. And you can grant those to groups as well. So it's usually a good practice to assign role assignments to groups of people rather than to individuals. That way, when people join or leave teams, then they automatically get in and out as well. And then, of course, management groups also give you the ability to apply policies to all resources, again, either within a hierarchy or even throughout your whole organization. So if you have, for example, policies that that need to be applied everywhere for regulatory reasons or compliance reasons or something like that, then management groups and management group deployments will be a really good way to do that. And then tenant scope resources are a little bit of a different story. So these ones are a little bit strange. So you use a tenant scope resource to either create a brand new Azure subscription or to create or configure management groups. Now, one thing to be aware is tenant scope deployments actually require that you have special permission, and often many people don't have that permission within their Azure environment. So what you can do is even if you've got permission at a different part of the hierarchy, you might still be able to actually deploy resources that are themselves tenant scope resources. You just don't do that by submitting a tenant scope deployment. So that's one of the interesting things with Bicep and how these deployments work, is where you submit the deployment doesn't necessarily have to mean the same thing as where the resource is going to be deployed. And we'll see some of that a little bit later on. We also want to mention that not all Azure customers are able to programmatically create subscriptions. So this is something that you have to have the right kind of billing arrangement with Microsoft to be able to do. Most customers can, but not all. And I'd also say that if you're going to be working with management groups, then there's kind of a one-time thing you need to do to opt in to using management groups in your environment. Once you've done that, then you can kind of carry on and do everything from an automated perspective after that. So Barbara, how do resource IDs work for all of these different types of resources?
Yeah, I think the resource IDs kind of can explain on how subscriptions are a little bit weird overall, to say it like that. Because if you look at the hierarchy, you would expect subscriptions to be part of that management group deployment and not the tenant-wide one. But it is on the tenant side. And the resource IDs can help a little bit with understanding the structure that's behind everything. So what we see on the screen here is a resource ID for a resource group. And every resource within Azure has a resource ID. And for most resources, if you want to see them, in the menu on the portal, they have a properties item. And in the properties, you can most often find the resource ID, so you can see what happens. Or you can collect it through PowerShell for almost every resource. And if we break down this resource ID, what we see here is first it describes this subscription where the resource group is part of, and it gives you a subscription ID. And after that, it describes the resource group. So the resource group name is toy development in this case. So if you have the resource ID for a resource group or a resource, you always see by that in with subscription that resource or resource group is stored. Now, if we look back at subscriptions, they have their own ID. And this makes kind of sense if you see it like that. This is the subscription without the resource behind it or without the resource group behind it. So it's just a subscription which you can assign stuff to by using that resource ID.
Now, Barbara, I noticed that this subscription ID doesn't include the management group, even though that might be part of a management group hierarchy.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah, and that's the thing that we see where a subscription, it's part of a management group, but that's not part of the resource ID. And that's why you also deploy them at the tenant level and not at the management group level. They are children of the management group, but that relationship is, like it says on the slide, it's tracked in a different way. It's actually also quite flexible. It's not that hard to move subscriptions from one management group to another one. Which
right. So if I was to bake in a management group ID into a subscription ID, then potentially if I want to move subscriptions around later, that's going to cause a lot of problems, right? Because I need to change all of my subscription IDs, resource group IDs, and resource IDs, which really could be quite problematic.
Yeah, and I think if people have tried to move resources or resource groups from one subscription to another, with most resources it's possible, but it takes a little while. It always takes some time, while a subscription moving from one management group to another one is almost instantly. So you see they really have a different relationship with each other.
Yeah, okay. So speaking of management groups, how does a management group ID look?
Well, a management group ID doesn't have a code like the other one did. So it's not a bunch of numbers and letters behind each other like a subscription, but it has an ID that you give it yourself. So in this case, when we look at this resource ID, the management group is called production MG. That's the ID of the management group. And with management groups, it can be a bit tricky. You have the management group ID, which is something you create yourself, but it also has a display name. The identifier you cannot change afterwards. You can still make it human readable if you want to. There are some limitations. I think can't have spaces in it and stuff like that. But the most important thing is you cannot change it. The display name you can change afterwards if you want to. So it's good to keep track of that they are not the same thing. Although at a lot of cases I've seen them being called the same thing. So they are the same value, but you can change the display name if you want to.
Okay, cool. And so if I'm going to create a resource within a management group, how does that look like? What's the resource ID look like within a management group?
When we place it in a management group, what we see is that first it defines the provider management. So the management group is in the management providers. And you see all resources have their own provider, and our management group also have that provider, which sort of defines the type of the resource or type of ID that we're talking of. So we see here that the management group is part of the Microsoft.management provider, while the role definition we see here at the bottom is part of the Microsoft.authorization provider. So in this example is a role definition that is part of a management group, which you can use to give someone permissions to do stuff.
Cool.
And I see a question coming up in the chat, and it's not really part of this one, but maybe you know this and can give a quick answer to this. Is it possible to create deny role assignments with Bicep?
So deny role assignments are a special thing that really apply to Azure Blueprints. I haven't worked with them recently. I know there's been some changes around some of the stuff and how that works. I believe it is possible to create those in Bicep, but I off the top of my head, I don't know all the details. Apologies to whoever asked that question. But Brandon may be able to find a link for some more information and drop that in the chat.
That is an excellent question, by the way.
It is, yes. And deny role assignments is something that a little bit tricky. We're getting some additional support, I think, later in this year or next year for additional types of deny role assignments. But right now they are tied to Azure Blueprints, is my understanding.
Yeah, what you could do is create a custom role and make it part of that. That will work. So that's one of the ways you can use. So anyway, back to the resource IDs. It was a little step aside there. So we've talked about all those resource IDs. Now, how does that work in practice? because we were talking about scopes, not about resource IDs. But what we just saw is that we have a resource group here, and at the bottom we have an Azure policy. And I can assign that Azure policy to that resource group, so that it only applies on the resource group. But if we looked at all the different resource IDs we have available, I can also apply that one, make it part of the subscription. So it will be assigned to the subscription level. But I can also take it a step further and assign that policy to the management group. So this gives me a lot of flexibility, especially when working with policies, to see at what scope I want to assign them.
Awesome. Okay. So now we've talked about the theory behind some of these scopes. Let's look at how we actually might do some of this in Bicep, and how we might start using the Bicep language to deploy some of our resources at all these different scopes that Barbara's just talked about. So firstly, when you write a Bicep file, Bicep needs to know the scope at which that file will be deployed. And that information is really important because that's what helps us to do things like show the right information in autocomplete and IntelliSense lookups, to validate resource types are correct and that kind of thing. It's not valid, for example, for you to create a storage account at a subscription or a management group or a tenant scope, right? They have to be deployed at the resource group scope. But then equally, it's not valid for you to create a subscription, an Azure subscription within a resource group, or a resource group within a resource group, right? Yeah. So there's all these different rules and kind of things that apply. So we need to tell Bicep what to do. Now, by default, Bicep uses a target. But there's the target scope keyword in Bicep that we'll see in some Bicep file shortly. By default, Bicep uses the target scope of the resource group. All right, so that means that if you don't specify anything else, just like you've been doing right up to this point in this Learn Live series, then by default, Bicep will just assume that all of the resources are intended to be deployed in resource groups. But if you set the target scope to subscription, then of course Bicep will understand that that's what you're trying to do. Or you can also set it to management group. And I should say, if you're telling Bicep that you're going to be deploying to the scope of a management group, you're not actually specifying which management group you're going to deploy to. You're just saying the resources in this file will eventually be deployed into a management group. And then when you submit the deployment, then you tell Bicep, or you tell the deployment engine where you want to actually deploy the resources to. Just like when you're deploying to a resource group, right? You don't define the resource group within your Bicep file. You define that at the point where you're deploying the Bicep template. And then, of course, the final target scope is tenant. And as we talked about before, there's only a few resources that are deployed at that scope. And as it happens, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on, it's actually not really necessary to ever create a tenant scope deployment, like a file with target scope equals tenant. You can actually create scopes, a Bicep file that are at a lower scope, and then target the tenant scope with particular resources. But again, we'll get back to that shortly.
Yeah, I think the cool thing is that if you think, well, do I have the right scope or how should I work? Then the Visual Studio Code extension will actually help you out. Because in most cases, if you have a resource that cannot be deployed to a certain scope, it will tell you to say this scope is not supported helpful for this one,
Absolutely.
Which really helps. It's a big fan of that Visual Studio Code extension.
Absolutely.
So an example of how you could use a target scope for a resource. If you deploy, for example, a resource group, you can't do that to a resource group scope because it's already in a resource and you can't nest them. So this is a very basic example of the target scope is the subscription level, and then it deploys a resource group with the great name example resource group. This would be a valid subscription scope deployment, and it will create one resource group. We're going to see that in practice in just a second. And if you want to deploy stuff, as we just said, this is where you actually define what tenant or what management group or what subscription you want to deploy stuff to. You can do this in Azure CLI or PowerShell. And as you see in the Azure CLI, you start off with AZ deployment and then define whether it's tenant, management group, subscription, or group. And then create, and after that, you will define which management group, subscription, or resource group you're actually talking about. And you can also do that in PowerShell. You have all the default The messages, the one commandlets, the one you're probably already familiar with is new AZ resource group deployment. You can change that to new AZ subscription deployment, management group deployment, and tenant deployment. And I think if you use AZ subscription deployment, it will by default just use whatever context you are running in at that point, because an AZ session is always part of a certain subscription already. So yeah, that's the easiest one. And if you use management group and resource group and tenant, then you need to define which one you're actually deploying to.
Awesome. Okay, let's see how this actually works. All right, we've talked a lot. Let's actually put some code together.
Let's see it in practice.
So what we're going to do in this exercise is we're going to create a subscription scope Bicep file. We're going to add some policy, Azure policy definitions, and then we're going to deploy it. All right, and we're going to see how that all looks. So let's pull up Visual Studio Code. So what I've got here is I've just got a blank Bicep file, which is just I've called it main.bicep. I've got nothing in it yet. We'll start to fill it out in just a moment. Now, one of the things that we'll also talk about as we go is there are a few little kind of slight differences in how you deploy for these different scopes compared to how you deploy for a resource group. And when we get to actually executing the deployment in a little bit, I'll talk about the fact that you have to specify a deployment location, which often can trip people up as well. So we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. So we've got a blank Bicep file here. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to tell Bicep that my target scope for this file is subscription. Right, so Bicep now understands that everything that's going in this file will be deployed at a subscription scope. One little side note I'll mention is that currently the Bicep team is actually thinking about making a change to the Bicep language that will mean that the way that you specify the target scope could change in future. So if you're watching this video later and this syntax doesn't work, go and check out the Bicep docs to see what the latest syntax is, because there is a possibility that will change before we get to version 1.0 of Bicep. Okay, so we've got a blank Bicep file. Now I'm going to copy and paste the Azure policy definition here, because this isn't kind of central to what we're talking about here, but it is something that's worth walking through. And in fact, I'll put in a couple of variables too. So what we're going to do first is deploy a thing called a policy definition. So an Azure policy definition specifies the rules that a certain group of resources should follow, right? And if you actually look at Azure policy, if you've never worked with it before, when you're using Azure policy, imagine that you're essentially, or one of the things you can do with it is you can essentially put a little gate between when somebody is trying to deploy a resource, whether that's coming in from Bicep or ARM templates or the portal or Terraform or anything else, and the actual deployment being executed. So that's a really useful thing, because you can inspect those deployments on the way through and check to see if they meet your policies. And if they don't, then you can essentially tell the Azure deployment engine to abort the deployment. There are other things you can do with policies as well that we won't get into today. So what we're doing here is we're firstly defining a policy. Now, a policy definition by itself is just explaining the rules. It doesn't actually put any enforcement in place, right? All it's doing is just saying, here are the things that I want to look out for, and this defines this policy. So we're saying this is a custom policy. And the important part of a policy definition is this policy rule here. What we're doing here is saying, if all of the following criteria are met, and we'll get into that in a second, then the effect of this policy should be to deny, which basically means we don't allow this deployment to continue to proceed. And what are those things that we're looking for? Well, we're looking for all of the following criteria. So firstly, we're looking to see, is the resource that's being deployed a virtual machine? Right? Because this policy will inspect every deployment that's going through. So it could be that you're deploying a storage account. We don't care about storage accounts for the purpose of this policy. So we need to make sure we filter this to just look at virtual machines. And then we also need to say, if the virtual machine's SKU name property is one of these values, standard F or standard G, and we actually look for anything after F or G, then it kind of meets these criteria, and then we need to deny the policy assignment. Sorry, the policy, to deny the deployment. So what we're essentially doing here is saying, look for all deployments where we're trying to deploy a virtual machine with these particular SKUs, right? And so this is really powerful, right? It gives you a lot of options to be able to control what's happening in your environment. Azure policy is a whole other topic that we're not really doing a deep dive into today, but if you're interested in this, then there's a whole lot of content on Microsoft Learn and Microsoft Docs that you can look at to understand this more.
But what's
But the key thing,
actually fun here is this in the Azure portal. This is a JSON, right?
that's right. Yes, yes. And you can kind of, if you've ever worked with Azure Policy with JSON, you can see how this translates, but Bicep just gives you a little bit slightly nicer way of working with it. You still have to provide all the same information in basically the same structure, but you don't have to have quite as many of the kind of commas and quote marks and so forth.
It's really cool that Bicep understands that.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, the key part here is that we're deploying this policy definition to a subscription scope. And then, of course, the policy definition by itself doesn't actually stop us doing anything, right? All that's doing, as I said before, is it's specifying the rules, but it doesn't apply those rules. So we then create another resource called a policy assignment, which again is deployed at the subscription scope. And that says, now we want to apply this policy over the scope that I'm deploying it, right? So because we're deploying this policy assignment into a subscription scope as well, then everything within that subscription will inherit that policy. Okay, so now we've got a complete Bicep file to deploy a policy, right? And you can imagine you could create a whole bunch of these different policies with different configurations, looking for different things. You might apply them in different places in your hierarchy and so forth. So what we need to do next is deploy it. Now, I've got the Visual Studio Code terminal open. I'm using a Mac, so I've got ZSH shell. And what I'm going to do is specify some variables first. So I'm going to say my template file is named main.bicep. I'm also then going to create a variable for the deployment name. And if you look at this, I'm saying deployment name should be called sub-scope-, and then it should include this variable here, which is today's date. Now, we haven't really had to do this before when we've deployed other resources into resource groups, for example, and other Bicep files into resource groups. We don't really have to do much to specify deployment names. Not only that, but when I actually start to, and I'll execute this because it might take a moment to run. When I deploy this Bicep file, I also need to specify a location, right? And again, we haven't really been used to this in the way that we've worked with resource groups before. So remember that deployments in Azure Resource Manager, a deployment is itself a resource. So if you open up the deployment history in the portal, and we'll do that shortly, or if you can even query deployments from PowerShell or from the Azure CLI, you are actually querying an Azure resource, right? The deployment itself is a resource. And that resource needs to be firstly given a name, and secondly, it needs to be created in a particular location. And it has to follow the same kind of rules as the rest of Azure. So when we deploy a deployment, right, when we create a deployment by using this AZ deployment create command, I'll get back to this in a second, we have to specify, here's the name of the deployment resource we're going to create, and then here's the location. Now, in a resource group deployment, the location of the deployment is just the same as the location of the resource group, right? We've already got a location we can put all of that deployment history and metadata into. But when we deploy against a subscription or a management group or a tenant, there is no location, right? Subscriptions aren't created in a specific location. Management groups aren't created in a specific location. And so we need to tell Bicep or tell Azure, when we're deploying this resource, the deployment should go into this particular location. So that is a slightly unusual kind of feeling thing. If you're not used to this, then that can feel a little bit strange. But of course, the tooling will help you, right? If you try to deploy without a location or without a name, it will guide you. And in fact, the name is actually optional. If you don't specify a name, it will just take the name of your file name. So in this case, it would call the deployment main. One thing to be aware of with that, though, is because you can't have two different resources with the same name in different locations, that's one of the kind of the Azure rules. If you try to just inherit the name from the file name, and just use the name, for example, main, then if you deploy that today into West US, that's fine. But if somebody comes along tomorrow and also uses the name main and tries to deploy that into East US or West Europe, then that deployment will fail because there's already a deployment resource in another location. So for that reason, when you're working with subscriptions and management group and tenant deployments, it's usually a good idea to specify a unique name for your deployments. And that's, of course, what we're doing here when we create this little date stamp that goes on it.
I must say, I also like to do that with resource groups.
What's that? Sorry, Barbara, can you repeat that?
With resource group deployments, I also like to define a unique value because it makes your history more clear. Because if it already finds a deployment with the same name, it will override it.
That's
so
right.
it makes
Yeah.
your history less clear. And I have seen in the past that it can give some unexpected behavior, but I've heard that that's a bug that shouldn't happen.
Mhm.
But I've made it a practice for myself to always create deployment names that are based on the date, or if you're using pipelines that are based on the build.
Right. Yeah, that's a really, really good practice. Yeah. All right. So we have submitted this deployment. So as you can see here, we've used this AZ deployment sub create command. So previously, when you've worked with Bicep, you would have used AZ deployment group create. And as Barbara talked about before, there's PowerShell equivalents for all of this as well. So when we deploy using the AZ deployment sub create, apart from this location property being kind of a required extra piece of information, it looks very similar to any other deployments that we do, right? So we specify the name, we specify the template file. And once we do that, we can now see that deployment has successfully completed. And I'm actually going to open up the portal and we can have a look to see what this deployment looks like. And again, we're querying the deployment resource here, right? So the information that we're looking at is part of that deployment history. So I've got my Azure subscription here. And what I can do is I can run down to the deployments menu item. And I can see here that we've actually got a deployment name of subscope 8th of June 2022. And of course, for me, it is the 8th of June. I know for many of you, it's probably the 7th of June, but I live in the future down here in New Zealand. And so we this looks just like a standard deployment, right? If you've ever looked at any deployments for a resource group, it's exactly the same kind of structure, right? We can see the deployment details with the list of the resources we've deployed. If we had parameters, we'd see them here. If we had outputs, we'd see them here. We don't have either in this case. And of course, we can actually look at the template, and this is the JSON version of the Bicep file. So really, once we've actually deployed a subscription scope template, apart from those kind of little things we talked about around, making sure you name your deployments and then put them in a location, it's very, very similar to any other kind of deployment, right? Now, the other thing I'll just mention too is that when we work with Bicep for when we start working with subscriptions and management groups, we have to be very careful about cleaning up any resources that we've created as part of our testing. Now, if you're working in resource groups, you can very easily delete all of the resources you've deployed by just deleting the resource group, right? It's a one-time operation. That's one of the nice things about resource groups is everything is packaged together. So if you've got a little test environment with a whole bunch of resources in it, you can delete the resource group and all those resources go away. But when we start working with subscriptions and management groups and tenants, if we create resources to test with, we have to make sure we go through and delete them all one by one. And of course, because in this Learn module, we're not going to be able to use the Microsoft Learn sandbox environment if you're following along with the Learn module. So this is really important because otherwise, if you keep this policy around, you now basically stop yourself from deploying virtual machines with those particular SKUs, which is probably not what you really want.
That's going to bite back, yeah.
Yes, and it's one of those things where you might not realize that you've done it until 6 months' time when you go to deploy something and it fails and you can't remember why. So when you start testing against these kinds of deployments, it's a really good practice to immediately clean up after yourself. Don't leave things lying around. So we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to firstly query my Azure subscription ID, and then I'm going to run a couple of commands to firstly delete the policy assignment and then to delete the policy definition. So these are deleting those resources that our deployment just created. And as I said, there's not really an easy, nice way to delete these together in one way yet. That is something that we're actually working on. But right now, you have to do this one by one. So what we've done in this exercise is we've created one of these templates and then deployed it, right? And we've talked about some of those little extra considerations around deploying subscription scoped templates. When we did that, we created a policy definition and an assignment that will prevent anybody from deploying those virtual machine SKUs, the F series and G series SKUs, into our subscription. We deployed it and made sure that deployment succeeded, and then of course we cleaned up after ourselves. All right, so Barbara, let's talk about how we might deploy to multiple scopes in a single deployment.
Yeah, because I think if you look at the subscription one we just did with all the, imagine all the policies in there and how handy that would be. An example for a landing zone. environment, this would take a lot of headaches away. So it would be a really great option.
Absolutely.
But in practice, you might want to take it even a step further and want to think about if I want to deploy to multiple scopes within one template. So some use cases you could think of is, for example, if you want to deploy stuff to 2 different resource groups in one template. So that could be because you're deploying a virtual machine in one resource group and a NIC, so a network interface card, in another one because it needs to be part of a virtual network, for example. If that's the road you decided to go with, then it would be handy to be able to do that in one template. But another great one, especially if you're doing a subscription, is to create both the resource group and the resources within it. Before we had subscription templates, you would first have to use, for example, PowerShell to create a resource group and then do the deployment. So you can do that now in one step. And another one we're going to see later on is how you can deploy both management groups and subscriptions in one template. So if you want to set up the basis of, for example, a landing zone, they can do that all with a template. And if you have a lot of customers, then you can just run it multiple times for all of them. So how would that work? You can't actually do this with most resources. You can't set a specific scope on the resource itself, but you can do this with modules. And you want to use modules anyway in a lot of ways because they really help with adding flexibility while still being consistent. So it's really a great way to run larger environments. And what you see in the example here is we have a target scope, which is subscription, and then the module has its own scope, the scope for the resource group. This is the way that you would define what the resource group would be. You would use the resource group keyword and then add the name of that resource group. So that is something you can do if you want to deploy something to a specific resource group. And as you see, this is a network module, and you would not be able to deploy that to a subscription scope anyway. So otherwise it would fail.
Cool. So Barbara, what's this resource group Bicep function that we're using here? This resource group and that specifies toy networking. Well, how does that work?
It collects the information from a resource group. So in this case, it defines another resource group, but you will probably have seen it already while using it empty. If you use resource group and then the bracket open, bracket close, then it will use the resource group that you're currently in. And you can use it to define the location. It's used a lot to define the location of all the resources, but also the name or the subscription or stuff like that. And in this case, it's used as an entity. So we're not just saying, hey, the scope is this resource group name. No, we're saying this is an entity, which is a resource group, and that should be the scope.
Cool. Okay.
So another one that we saw was what we just mentioned was a network interface and a virtual network that both need to deploy it at the same time. So you want to deploy them from the same template. But they are both different scopes. And if we move over one slide, we'll see, excuse me, that you can use a module for that. So we have main.bicep, where we will define the network interface directly, which will be part of the project teddy bear resource group. And then we use a module called network.bicep, and we define the scope for that module to be the toy networking resource group. And if you would deploy this, we have the example as well. So if you see here, we have the network module, which is scoped at a different resource group. So in this case, the network toy networking one. But the nice thing you see here is with the network interface resource that we can now appoint it to that subnet in that network module. So we can use the ID that comes out of that module, which is one of the outputs, and use that for that network interface. So this makes your template a lot more simple than if you would have 2 templates for this, because then you wouldn't be able to refer to it like this. You could use existing for that, but that's extra code that you would have to write. So this can be a really nice way to actually make your template simpler and more readable that way. Cool. And if you would deploy this, you would deploy it to the resource group project teddy bear. So that's the main resource group. That's the one that would be referred to with the resource group and then just the brackets and no value in between them. That's where it would be deployed. And then Bicep would understand that that network, the other one, the virtual network, needed to be part of the toy networking resource group. So it would understand.
So just to be clear, so you deploy into one resource group, but then can kind of have that deployment reach into another resource group and deploy into that, right? That's what we're saying here.
Exactly. It understands that it needs to use both of them.
Okay, cool. Now, what happens if those resource groups are in two different subscriptions? Is it possible to do that?
Absolutely. You can do that as well. And that's an extra value you can use to the resource group entity. So here we have that resource group keyword again, and now we have defined a subscription ID before we defined the resource group name. So if you don't define a subscription ID, it will default to the current subscription. So the one of the resource group you're already deploying, and your deployment is too.
Yeah, so I can start to see now how you can build up a Bicep file that's doing a lot of different things, right? It's deploying a lot of resource groups and doing a whole lot of stuff, all orchestrated from one kind of key deployment.
Yeah, and for example, if we move back to those landing zones, this could be handy for a connection between the hub network and the spoke network. Of course, what you do need to remember is that you need permissions to both resource groups to actually be able to do that. So if you lack permissions in one of them, you won't be able to do this.
Right. Makes sense. Cool.
There are a few resources where you can actually define a scope on the resource itself. Not a lot of them. Most of them you need to do with modules, but for example, with extensions, which can be part of a virtual machine, you can use that scope. So the scope would be the virtual machine. So it wouldn't apply to another resource group or another subscription. It would apply to another resource.
And I think there was actually a Learn Live session a few weeks ago about extension resources and also child resources. So if you're not familiar with extension resources, it'd be worth having a look at that, because things like role assignments can also be considered extension resources, right? We can define a role assignment and then apply that to any resource, really. Like a storage account can have a role assignment applied to it. So that's a case where you can use the scope keyword.
That's very handy for managed identities, for example. They often need permissions to one resource, maybe to a key vault, maybe to a storage account, and then you can use the scope that way.
Great. Okay, cool. And we've also talked to you about tenant scope resources as well, right? So tenant scope resources can also have a scope keyword applied to them, which we can't do for most resources.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So here we have the tenants one. Yeah, if you can move to the next one and you can see some examples of tenant one. In this case, it's management groups. And this is the funny one because it's not what you would expect, because the target scope is management group and then the subscope is tenant. I think you're going to talk about this a little bit more later, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Yeah.
So first, let's just see how this actually works and see this in practice. So if we move over to my screen, I have Visual Studio Code set up here. And I actually am starting off with the same template that John just used to deploy his policy definition and his policy assignment to the target scope, which was a subscription. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a resource group. And the first thing I'll define here, and I'm going to copy paste this because if you're going to type this out, you're going to make typos. We're going to define a resource group name. So we're going to use that subscription to deploy that resource group. And what I'll do is I'll scroll to the bottom because we have everything already here, the policy assignment, policy definition. We saw that already. And now we're going to deploy a resource group in here. And we do that like this. So the resource is resource group, and it's called a resource group, and this will be deployed to that subscription. But now the fun thing, we're going to want to fill this resource group with something. And we're going to create a virtual network in there. So we're going to create a virtual network that's part of that resource group. We're going to use a module for that. And I have that module right here on the left. And I already created that file that's called a virtual network.bicep. And this is just a virtual network name, a prefix, and then it will create one virtual network. So we have a module that we can refer to in our main.bicep file. And I'm going to copy and paste this again. And if we look here, I've called the module by the location that it's in here. And here I have set a scope of that resource group. And it's a little bit might confuse a little bit that this scope is resource group, but that's this resource that it's defining. So if I would create another alias for this one, so if I would call this resource group for VNet, for example, for virtual network, then I would define it like this. But it makes it a little bit more clear that we're talking about an alias here. So we're using the resource group that we were actually deploying, and we are using that to make it possible to deploy that virtual network to that resource group.
So you're using that symbolic name, are you, Barbara?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
a really cool feature of Bicep. Nice.
Yeah, that's in the old way with ARM templates, this would be a pain because resource ID and it wasn't defined yet, and yeah, it's gonna take a long time. And in this case, this is actually a pretty quick way to set it up. I just have to define it like this. So I'll add the parameters real quickly. The virtual network name and the virtual network prefix, and then I would be able to deploy this. And I'm on a Windows computer here, so I'll use PowerShell. I can also use the Azure CLI, but the PowerShell window I'm using, and I've created the deploy.ps1 file to do that deployment. And here I've defined the same things that you did. So I defined the date and the deployment name, the virtual network name in this case, and the virtual network prefix. And I might need to address a little bit on what I'm doing here because people are not that familiar with it, might not know this one. I'm using splatting to create the parameters for the PowerShell file. And it's something we've been doing because what is the way we used to do things to make things readable is to use a backtick. So we use new AZ subscription deployment and then put the parameters after that and then use backticks so that the lines don't get too long. But a backtick has one downside, and that is very tiny and it's very easy to miss. And it was the point to add on readability while it's something that's barely readable. So what we've been doing in the PowerShell community is using splashing, where we just create a hash table with all the parameters we need. And then we can call it in a commandlet with an @ sign. So this does exactly the same as using backticks. And it gives an extra added flexibility because you can very easily change parameters because it's a hash table. So it's something you can work with. So that's just a little bit of the PowerShell knowledge, right? A little tip for your own parameters.
That's a useful one. Thank you.
Yeah, it works very well. So I would be able to deploy this and just run this. I've pressed F8 to run it, and it will start running this. Now, if you deploy something and do it this way, they have a tendency, if they're being watched, that they're suddenly very slow. So I did deploy this already just to be sure, because I found Azure being very slow when it's being watched, just like a pod. Yeah. So I took the time to deploy this already beforehand. I'd learned from Brandon, who is in our chat, who said it's like a cooking show where you stick something in the oven and after that you just say, and here is the ready baked cake already. So here's the cake that we made. And in my subscription, I can here see that deployment that Jon also just saw the same way, although here it's still the 7th. I'm not from the future.
Got flying cars down here.
Looking forward to it. Don't tell us yet what's going to happen. No spoilers. And here I can see the deployment that's being made. And I can see everything about this deployment, but I can see something else. And that is in the resource group. This is the resource group we just created. So toy networking, the resource group. And here we have that virtual network within that resource group. And if I look over here, I can also see that deployment. This is just virtual network. Now there's always a separate deployment when you're working with modules. a module makes its own deployment in the Azure portal. And this one's the virtual network module. It's created its own deployment. So we can see very well that first the resource group was created, and then after that, this is where the virtual network was deployed. Which is
actually, if you look at the Bicep, the JSON file that a Bicep file emits, and have a look at what a module does, you'll actually see it creates a resource of type Microsoft.resources/deployments. Right, that's what a module kind of compiles or transpiles into. So hopefully, some of these pieces are starting to click into place now. That these are all kind of using the same underlying concepts, but in different ways.
And it is fun that way how if you have worked with ARM templates for a long time, you have kind of gone a long way without ever knowing that there's a deployment behind there.
Mm-hmm.
You've gone a long way, especially if you were like me and you hated nested deployments. I really dislike that. Mm-hmm. And now we're still doing nested deployment, but now they're modules and now they're very cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. And now we can ignore it until we get to the advanced part of Bicep, right? That's really nice.
So yeah, if we switch back to the screen, we can probably see what happened over here. Switch back to the slides.
Cool.
And I'll move back here. And what we did is we created a resource group and we added a module for that virtual network. And then we used it in the subscription deployment, verified it, and then deployed it through Azure. What I haven't done in this case is cleaned up the resources. If I didn't deploy that policy, I could have cleaned it all up by just cleaning up that resource group. But if you have followed along and you did deploy a policy, then you need to remove it like John just did.
All right, let's talk now about creating a management group and subscription hierarchy. So we're going to kind of put together all of these pieces that we've talked about now into kind of a more complicated use case, right? So we've learned all these little tips and tricks along the way, and we've learned all these concepts. Now, if we're going to create a management group and a subscription hierarchy, we kind of need to build on all that knowledge that we've just learned. So let's imagine that we need to create a hierarchy that's something like this, right? So we've got our root of our hierarchy is our tenant. We've got a management group called our root management group underneath that. And then let's say we decide to separate out our production and non-production environments. Now, there's actually a whole debate and controversy about whether this is a good way to set up your environment or not. I'm not going to get into that right now, but don't take this as kind of a recommendation of this approach. This is just an example of how you might configure some of your environments. Now, at the bottom here, we can see that we've got a subscription, which is called this very secret subscription. And if we want to deploy this from within Bicep, then we can do that, right? And what we're actually going to do is create a resource which allows us to deploy an Azure subscription. The resource type has kind of got a friendly name of a subscription alias, right? It's a slightly strange name. You create a subscription alias to actually deploy a subscription, but that's what you do. And of course, as we talked about before, subscription aliases or these subscriptions and knowledge checks are tenant scoped resources, right? So it's really important to understand that when you're deploying these are deployed at the tenant scope, even though they appear at a later part of the hierarchy. Now, as we've talked about previously, not all Azure customers are going to be able to do what I'm going to do right here. Most can, but depending on exactly how you've got your billing arrangement set up with Microsoft, then you may or may not be able to run these examples. So this isn't a comprehensive example, right? We've linked in the Learn module to details of how you can actually fill out all the details necessary to create a subscription, because there's a bunch of other stuff you need to provide. But the key thing I want to highlight here is that you've got this resource, which again is just a standard Bicep resource called a Microsoft.subscription/aliases. And that is deployed, as you can see, at the scope of tenant. And then you give it a name and you give it all these other properties as well. So if you are to deploy this, and again, if you've got the necessary permissions and so forth, then a new Azure subscription will be created, right? That's pretty cool. And so you can then use this as part of your automated deployment process, or if you're deploying lots of subscriptions for lots of different teams, you can potentially use Bicep to do that. Now, once you've created a subscription, by default, that subscription may not be associated with the management group that you want it to be in, right? You probably want to put it in a specific part of your management group hierarchy. And to do that, as you notice, we've kind of got this difference between logically where the subscription sits in terms of your hierarchy, and physically where it sits, which is a tenant scoped resource. So we need to tell the management group kind of hierarchy whereabouts the subscription should go. And so we have another resource type, which is this type Microsoft.management/management group/subscriptions. So this is a tenant scoped resource. And if you look carefully, it's actually a child resource of the management group. And it essentially says this management group that I'm going to specify should have this subscription inside it. So let's have a look at some code, and we're not going to run this code, but of course, if you've got access to an Azure environment, then you can have a look at the Learn module and follow along with this later. So the first thing we're going to do is create a management group subscription association. So we're going to set the target scope for this file to be tenant. And then we've got a couple of parameters there. One is to give us the name of the management group that we want to deploy this subscription association into, right? So this is the association resource. This isn't the management group. This is just telling it where in the management group hierarchy it should go. And of course, the subscription ID that we've just created. And then we've got an existing resource here to point to the management group. All right, so we use that management group name to get a reference to that management group. And then the last resource there is that subscription association. So this becomes one of the building blocks of our deployment, right? This by itself doesn't give us the whole hierarchy, but this gives us a piece of it. And then what we can do in our main.bicep file is we can now create a whole bunch of other resources. So we can start by saying this bicep file is targeted at a management group scope. And what it will contain is a parent management group, which is this non-production management group that we saw on that slide before. And then within that, there is a child management group. And of course, in both cases, the scope of these management groups must be tenant, because management groups are created at the tenant scope. That's that kind of physical scope that it's created at. When it comes to actually defining the hierarchy, which management groups sit where, that's where we use the parent property on the child management group. If we scroll down, we can then see we've got that subscription that we created before, right? So this is now creating the actual Azure subscription, and then using the module that we just saw to create a subscription association. So what we're doing here is defining a parent management group, a child management group, a subscription, and then linking that subscription into that management group hierarchy. And as you can see, that we're using lots and lots of different features of Bicep to do that, right? We're using these existing resources, modules, we're using the tenant scope deployments, we're using the scope keyword, child resources, all these different things that you've learned about over the last few weeks. We're putting that all together now into a pretty complicated example.
Yeah, I'm thinking of how you would accomplish this with ARM templates, and I probably just not. Yeah.
Yeah, it is doable. I mean, obviously it is doable because Bicep is doing it.
It's creating
templates,
it,
but writing this is definitely challenging, and it's something that I think a lot of customers are a lot more keen on now that we've got a nice way to do it. All right, so we're not going to run through that example, as I said, but what we are going to do is look at how we can deploy some resources to a management group, right? So this is a slightly simplified example, I guess, of some of these same concepts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. And we've got the Bicep file that I created before, right? So this is not the same one that Barbara had. This is one that we did in our first exercise. And as we can remember, we've got the policy definition, policy assignment here. And we've currently got the target scope of this file set to subscription. Now, as it happens, what we want to do in this example is just apply that same policy about virtual machines further up the hierarchy to say, actually, we want this to apply to every subscription within this particular part of our hierarchy. Right. So what we're going to do firstly is, so thinking about back to our scenario, our R&D team and our toy company has said that they're going to have a bunch more subscriptions for different projects they're working on. So we've just said, well, to make that a bit more manageable, we're going to actually put all of those subscriptions into a management group, right? We're going to create a management group called Secret R&D Projects, and all of those secret R&D projects will have the same management group as kind of their parent, and then they will all inherit the same policies, the same role assignments, and so forth. So what we can do in this Bicep file is we can then just say, we want to change this to a target scope of management group. Apart from that, everything stays the same. right? We don't have to change any of the policy definition. We don't have to change the assignment. We're just changing where it's deployed. That's all that we're doing here.
Yeah, it doesn't even give any errors because it's
No.
completely possible to do a policy on a management group level.
Absolutely. I mean, so again, some resources don't always work this way, but certainly for Azure policy, for role assignments, those kinds of things, you can chop and change the target scope as you need to. Now, we need to firstly create a management group. Now, if I have a look back at the Azure portal, so under management groups in the portal, we can see our management group hierarchy. This is my hierarchy for one of my sample subscriptions. This is a pretty simple hierarchy, right? We've just got the tenant root group, which is that root management group, which contains my Azure subscription. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new management group. Now, as we saw a minute ago, we can actually do that in Bicep if we want to. Just for expediency, I'm going to run this using the Azure CLI. So it's doing exactly the same things as what Bicep is doing. It's just using the CLI instead. So I'm running this AZ account management group create command, and I'm saying the name of my management group, which is kind of the ID, should be secret R&D, and then the display name is secret R&D projects. So I'll run that. That creates this management group for us. And then in a moment, once this completes, then I'll go back to the portal and see if that's appeared. And of course, we've already updated our Bicep file to make it compatible with management groups. So when it comes time to deploy, then all we should need to do is kind of execute the deployment pointing to that same Bicep file, and we'll see how that works. So if I go back into the portal and refresh, there we go. We now have the secret R&D projects management group. Now you'll see that subscription that I created, or that subscription that I have, is not part of that management group right now. Of course, as we talked about before, I could move it into there. I could create a subscription association and move it into it. But right now, I'm going to keep that just as it is, because you can actually create all of these management groups and create policies and things without actually having any subscriptions in them. And that's a really nice way to test things out, to understand how this works. And then, of course, you could temporarily add a subscription in, see how all of that kind of stuff flows through, and then take it out again if you want to. But for simplicity here, we're just going to work with a management group without a subscription in it. So
yeah, I think we're pretty short on time probably, so maybe we should focus on that subscription for this one.
Focus on the subscription?
Yeah, you were gonna place a subscription, right? Or where?
No, not on this one. No, we're just going to submit the deployment, and that'll be that. So, if we create so the same as before, we've got a whole bunch of properties that we're going to be using for our deployment, and then I can submit the deployment by using AZ deployment MG create, MG being management group, and you can see it works very similarly to when we work with subscriptions. So subscription scope deployments. The big difference here is that we have to specify the management group ID that we want to deploy to. As Barbara mentioned earlier, if we're submitting a subscription scope deployment, then the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell already knows which subscription that we want to work with, right? That's part of the context that we set in our Azure CLI environment or our PowerShell environment. With a management group, there is no context, so we need to specify that.
And the management group ID is a readable name you have set yourself, hopefully.
That's right, yeah. So in this case, the management group ID is that secret R&D value, which we set when we created the management group. And so if I go back to the management group list, and I open up our new management group, and then go to the deployments list, I'll actually see our deployment here. Again, it's got the same kind of name structure that we saw before. And just as before, this is a standard deployment, right? We can open it up, we can look through all the resources it created, and so forth. And of course, as we talked about earlier, we could also clean up. Well, I won't do that now, just for expediency purposes. But if we wanted to do that, then in this case, we can actually just delete the entire management group using a CLI or a PowerShell command, and that will get rid of all of the stuff that we've created in this demo.
Yeah, and this is really nice to play around with the management groups. If you have permissions in your Azure tenant to do that, you can just create them, delete them, and see what you can actually do with them in the portal menu.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. So
let's see if it actually works. I think we might skip the first question and start with the second one and see if we can do the third.
Yep, sounds good. All right. So have a think through this scenario. So you need to create a role definition that will work throughout your entire organization. You're going to, of course, deploy this using Bicep, right? Which target scope values should you use for that file? So again, think about, you're going to create a role definition. It needs to work across your entire organization. What's the best target scope value to use? Now, Barbara, I'm wondering why we don't have resource group listed here. What do you think? Is there a good reason why resource group isn't included as a target scope?
Yeah, maybe it's like whole organization and resource group don't
Probably
really
a bit too granular.
fit in with each other. Probably it's already like, the whole organization and resource group, that kind of gives a hint that might not be the one.
Awesome.
Yeah, we can give people some time to consider, and you can add the answer at aka.ms/polls. You can give your own answer, and we can see all the answers, or you can scan the QR code and see what people think.
Yeah, great. We'll give it another couple of seconds, and then we'll see what everybody thinks. All right, we've had one vote, and that one vote was for answer B. So was that correct? Yes, it was.
Yeah. The subscription is pretty obvious, but obvious. I say it like the subscription. It's never going to be the whole organization. If you have more than one subscription, which we have been talking about, you always have the risk of another subscription getting involved, even if you only have one. But this is what we actually talked about, that you might think that this is on the tenant level, because
the tenant is the root of the hierarchy, right? It applies to the whole organization.
Right.
Yeah. But in actual fact, the role assignments and role definitions can't be created at the tenant scope, right? Those are created at management groups or below. So if you want to apply that to your whole organization, you can apply that to the root management group, and that will be inherited by all of your management groups and all of your subscriptions and resource groups and resources.
All right, I think we can sneak in one more.
I think so.
Yeah, let's do it. So everyone, as soon as you see it, vote very quickly, because time is not our friend right now. So the question is, which of these statements is true? Which is A, resource deployed to a management group scope has a subscription ID in its resource ID. B, management groups must be deployed to the tenant scope. And C, management groups must be deployed in the scope of a parent management group.
So this is a bit tricky, right? Because some of these things we talked about around management group hierarchies and kind of how that works at a logical level versus a physical level, that's all, you have to kind of understand that well to get this right.
Yeah, exactly. You need to think of what part was the logical part and what part really was the technical part. So where do you define stuff? This does get easier once you work more with it. Once you get more familiar with it, it starts making sense. But especially if you're starting out with management groups, it might be a bit confusing.
All right, so get your votes in now. We've just got a few more seconds before we close this up.
Yeah, gonna give people the chance to vote. And I see one vote coming in, and we're gonna do it for one vote. Yeah,
Yep.
Why don't you tell us,
good.
John, which answer is wrong? Oh, you already gave it away. Building some tension there.
Sorry, should have listened carefully to what you were saying there.
Oh, you're right. We didn't have time anyway. So can you explain these statements?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about the correct one first, right? So management groups, as we talked about, are deployed at the tenant scope. So even though there is a hierarchy with parent and child management groups, we don't actually deploy the management groups using those parent and child as their scopes, right? There's a separate way that we define that hierarchy. So that's why answer C is correct, and why answer B is answer C is incorrect. Answer B is correct. And then answer A, management groups are higher level than subscriptions, right? So there is no subscription ID as part of a management group ID, unlike something like a resource group, which is a child of a subscription. And so in that case, the subscription ID is part of the resource ID.
Yeah, and to make it a little bit more confusing, a resource deployed to a management group scope doesn't have a subscription ID, but also a subscription ID doesn't have a management. And subscription resource ID doesn't have the management ID in there.
That's right. Yeah. Remember, those things are tracked kind of as separate kinds of hierarchies, right? There's the physical and the logical hierarchies that we need to think about separately.
Just to make it a little bit more confusing. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So what did we learn about today? We learned about the scopes of resources, all different scopes you can use, the tenant level, management group level, and subscription level resources. And we were already familiar with resource group level resources. We've deployed resources at different scopes with Bicep templates, like that policies we saw, or the resource group and the VNet within the resource group. And we learned how we can use one template to deploy to multiple scopes.
Awesome. So as we talked about, you can follow along with this Learn module yourself later, or you can share it with friends by going to this link. This is an advanced Learn module, right? You probably have got the sense already now that some of these concepts are a bit complicated. They're a bit tricky. That some of them aren't obvious, and they kind of require a bit more thought and a bit of practice to really understand how they all fit together. So absolutely feel free to go back and follow along with the Learn module to revisit these concepts. Follow along with the exercises if you can. That's a really good way of understanding kind of what works and what doesn't. And of course, if you've got access to it, then you can even do things like creating those management group and subscription hierarchies and so forth to really understand kind of how this all fits together. So
with all those Learn modules, the whole Learn thing about Bicep, even if you're familiar with it, you will still probably learn new things. So it's really cool to follow along with it.
Absolutely. It's very comprehensive, and there's a lot of material there, and a lot of tips and tricks as well about, the things that we try to remind people to do when they're writing Bicep code. That's kind of good for the real world, right? Not just good for following an exercise. Now, of course, this is as part of a series of episodes of Microsoft Learn Live. Next week, we're going to be passing over to our colleagues Will and Stephen, who are going to be talking about extending Bicep and ARM templates. Of course, we care mostly about Bicep by using deployment scripts. So this is an interesting feature of Azure Resource Manager as well, which lets you actually embed little bits of PowerShell or Azure CLI code into your deployments and run it as part of your deployment system. So Will and Stephen will be talking all about that next week. And you can either look through that Learn module ahead of time or join us next week to learn all about that. So don't miss that. And I think that's all we've got for today. So thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John, for doing this together with us. Thank you to Brandon and Monique for helping out in the chat.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for joining us. And please let us know if you've got any feedback.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks,
bye.
everyone. Bye.